Hello and welcome to Season 8, Episode 2 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop,
I'm Mark Bishop.
and we are, of course,
So
reading.
I
You
was
got distracted by something.
briefly distracted by my friend Violet,
Oh,
clicking around.
I see. We are, of course, reading George Lakoff's Moral Politics, How Liberals and Conservatives Think, which is a book that's attempting to describe the different sort of linguistic worldviews that people on the left and the right have. But as we talked about last week in the preface, it's very much sort of a biased account, sort of as it appears right now, trying to examine what these weirdo conservatives really think and how they, put their worldview together. But for this time, we are reading chapters 1 and 2. I think we decided we'd talk about both of those because they were fairly short. So talking about the mind and politics, just sort of an overview of what this book is going to be about, and then the worldview problems, so sort of setting up his two worldviews that he sees for both the left and the right. What do you think of these first two chapters, if you read both of them?
Yeah, that I was about to say. I didn't know I agreed to do two.
You suggested it.
I guess we can play the video or the audio back. I am somewhat unprepared
Mhm.
to
Well,
talk
because
about.
we read the preface in chapter 1 last week, and then you said,
Yes.
"Well, let's stop short and do chapter
Yes.
1 and chapter 2 together."
Okay. I
We can just talk about chapter 1. I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, if I just go on some unrelated rants for no reason, I'm not in a rant mood today.
Mhm.
But having said that, you can always provoke me.
Yes, I know.
So I'm a little unprepared for chapter two, and slightly in
Mhm.
this sense that I did not read it. Um,
So
because
completely unprepared.
because this weekend I was like, oh, I don't have to read for the podcast. I already read
Mhm.
it, but I didn't.
Mhm.
I should have read two.
Yes.
So
Well, we could just do chapter 1. We'll just do chapter 1. We can save chapter
yeah,
2 for next week.
maybe have a shorter one. Chapter one is sets the table. Really, I
Yes.
mean, we did the preface and talked about the author a little bit, but and started to talk about chapter one. But it really kind of is a summary of what we're going to do too. So
Mhm.
we'll talk a little bit more about that than we would maybe
Yeah.
just
Well,
chapters.
speaking of the
Are we going to
author,
do two and three next time?
no, we can just do 2. Let's just say just 2 next week, so we know for sure what we're doing. But speaking of talking about who the author is, I was looking up a little bit more about him, and he is. I don't know if this is still current, but at least up until a few years ago, he was like a scientific advisor for the Socialist Party in Spain, like one
Oh,
of their think tanks. So he was, an official member, I guess, in some capacity of the Socialist Party of Spain, on their think tank there.
I um formed a fascination of Francisco Franco.
Hmm.
Um, Fairly recent. I read I read Hemingway's book. Which one was it about the Spanish Civil War? I
Oh,
wrote
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
I read like three of them in succession. I always get the titles confused. Um, in any event, oh gosh, this is going to drive me crazy. But I read that, and then I read a history of the Spanish Civil War, and man, I mean, it was a bad scene,
Hmm.
on both sides. But somebody had to do something about those crazy communists.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying, I'm not one to say, well, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, and what's 10,000 dead
Yeah.
communists, that type of thing. But I think it's weird how until you read the details of these complex uh, uh, you know just I guess civil wars or struggles or armed factions,
Hmm.
um, how complex it really is. I mean, there's people that thought they were doing the right thing on both sides. And when I was growing up, it was like, oh, he's a dictator.
Hmm.
And same thing with what's his face? Was it in Chile? Dictator down there, Pinochet. Was he in
Hmm.
Chile?
Is that
Pinochet.
Argentina?
No, he was in Argentina, was he? I think he was
I don't know.
Chile. Any event.
I'll fact
Um,
check you.
yeah, well, and granted, I'm not saying that these are stellar people that you should model your
Mhm.
life after, but when you read or like you, I did read about Argentina, but I was thinking those lines are the Allende left wing government
Mhm.
that was overthrown. Was that? I'm trying, but I read
You're right.
about
Pinochet
Allende.
was Chile. Yeah.
Yeah, but I read about Allende, or I'm probably mispronouncing that, and the history of his tenure and what led up to the Civil War, which is really fascinating. discussion, because I think there's a lot of parallels between that and what the Democrats and leftists are doing in America, like this kind of this ratcheting up of change and making it more and more oppressive and difficult for the opposition to
Mhm.
function, and then also to have any sort of be heard, But so yeah, it's wild that people will like this guy. I don't know anything about him. I don't want to read too much about him. I was thinking about like, well, I'll study up about him, but I'd rather kind of have a blank slate
Mm.
to try to give him the credit that he is due. Um, but I don't know that I want to give him any credit after even
Mhm.
looking at this book. But anyway, so in the introduction, so it doesn't surprise me that he's a socialist. And there's an interesting, if you ever have a chance and you want to kill like an hour, go on YouTube and there used to be a show called Phil Donahue. He was a
Mhm.
predecessor to Oprah, and a lot of his shows were just like, oh, somebody cheated on me, that kind of stuff, and back in the day. But he was a lefty,
Mhm.
but he was a great interviewer. He kind of reminds me of Bill Moyers, like
Mhm.
that interview for that one season we did, because he's an honest person and he really is curious. And he had Milton Friedman on,
Hmm.
and there's especially a discussion about socialism and capitalism, and don't he asked something along the lines of, well, capitalism, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and all that stuff. And Milton Friedman had a really good defense and condemnation of socialism, because he says, well, it's greed, but we don't, just because you change the system, you don't remove greed or people's faults out of the system. He says, you don't think this is during the Soviet Union. That's how long ago it was.
Mhm.
You don't think the Soviet leadership has a greed and wants,
Mhm.
they're just doing things for the good of all people? No, of course they're humans, and so what you need is have a system that's set up so that individuals can make their own decisions. And anyway, so it
Interesting.
doesn't surprise me that this lefty who has obvious um, problems with conservatives,
Mhm.
and he doesn't come. So let me just start with it. So he's
Yes.
so the initial thing is, contemporary, the first quote, right, the first page of
Mhm.
chapter one. Contemporary American politics is about worldview. Conservatives simply see the world differently than do liberals, and both often have a difficult time understanding accurately what the other's worldview is. And I think
Mhm.
that's really, really true. So I
Yeah.
think he's certainly, the author is certainly intelligent enough to realize what the problem is. And I think
Mhm.
he in chapter one, at least, he really is accurately describing what the problem is as far as understanding each other. That
Yeah.
there is, and I do believe that he is right about there are two different types of worldview.
Mhm.
He talks about it, and he gets right into it, I think,
Mhm. Yeah.
which is
Well.
the
Mhm.
the father figure, mother figure type thing.
Mhm. I think it's only become, even of a bigger split now. And we were kind of talking about this last time. I think he's right. This is being written in 1994 for the original press in 1996, mid 90s, where he's writing this. But now we're even at the point where it's not just a worldview about politics; it's about a worldview about what reality really is at this point. I think, especially when you get into stuff like gender. Can people become the opposite sex than what they were born with? And, of course, you'll get wildly different answers to that depending on if you're a conservative or a liberal, because you have a completely different understanding of really what like the reality of that is. It's an entirely different way of looking at it. That's not just here's my worldview about what the government should do. It's here's my worldview about what all of the world even is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and I think you could see that. It doesn't surprise me he's a closet socialist when he's writing this. He's talking
Hmm.
about himself as being a liberal. Well, you don't hear the word liberal too much anymore, because the Republicans, the American public got fouled on the whole thing,
Hmm.
on the term liberals, and then they changed it to progressives,
Hmm.
because progressives used to be, FDR was a progressive,
Hmm.
uh, and Woodrow Wilson, may he burn in hell, what was the progressive racist, um, that really brought a lot of terrible things to our
Yeah.
country. But there's progress is like moving forward in a good way, and so
Hmm.
they said we're going to be progressives, but now they're just like, okay, we're commies. The mask is coming off, because they're trying to outleft each other in
Mhm.
their own internal battles, which is just wild.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Well,
so
I mean that's something that I've talked about. I know I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but the current Communist Club here on campus, I know I've mentioned they were originally Students for Democratic Society, then they became Progressive Students Alliance, and then they said, okay, yeah, now we're the Students for Communism.
yeah,
It's not that their political beliefs actually changed; they were just more accurate with their title.
right, and yeah, they're just the mask has slipped off,
Hmm.
and they're just being honest about what they're really wanting, which
Hmm.
is to subjugate us. And, I mean, it's really, I mean, just to put it out there. They want to be in control, and there's always there's a funny meme about these communists or socialists. They always have this dream that when the communist utopia comes in here, I'll be managing the farm and doing this and that, and I'm managing my farm and my people, my livestock with my family, and there'll be somebody that'll like the first comment will be your farm. Wait a second, and why are you not in the fields,
Hmm.
Steve?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, nobody ever expects to be the one, working the mines. They're always going to be the free poet gardeners who are going to live in the idyllic paradise, and
Yeah.
everything will be fine.
I finally got through my Chairman Mao biography book that
Oh,
was
good.
650 pages, and all of those people, well, they're just horrible people, and
Hmm.
and there's so many opportunities to have Mao killed and save the poor country from uh, from what he did to them. But of course, he had allies.
Hmm.
But a lot of the people, like the Cultural Revolution, they were the leadership, the original communist leadership were destroyed,
Hmm.
tortured, and sent out into the fields and died or died in prison. And if the leadership could be thrown in prison, some knucklehead on that just posts memes on Twitter or X or whatever
Hmm.
doesn't stand a chance when it
Yes.
really comes down. So let's get back to. I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
get
that's
back
another
to
rant.
yeah,
Like
that
the
was a
fifth
rant.
rant
There
already.
you go.
So I'm going to spread this thing out to another 3 hours. All right, so he gets into and I don't know how much we really want to talk about this
Hmm.
because it's a light philosophical topic, meaning light that he does not really go into any details of it, but he
Hmm.
talks about common sense and unconscious thought, which is his seems to be his main theme, at least so far. That people have a certain what we call common sense. It's really unconscious thought, which I don't know why people are so fascinated with unconscious thought. If it's unconscious, it's not a thought. Okay. You can't realize an unconscious thought any more
Hmm.
than you realize an unconscious bias. If it's unconscious, it's asleep, right? It's not doing anything.
Yes.
Um,
Well, I think
Different than subconscious. There used to
yes.
be a big thing about subconscious. Well, in your
Hmm.
subconscious, you have these desires, and okay, fine, Freud. Yeah, I get that, but the unconscious stuff. So
And I
he's
think that's really what he's talking about is more of, what you're saying is a subconscious thing. Because he talks about, what does a cognitive scientist do? That's what he says he studies. And it's the study of just how thoughts are formed in the brain, how our thoughts are articulated and things like that. And especially he says, cognitive linguists, study how those thoughts are transferred into words. And so
yeah,
essentially his point in saying that something is an unconscious thought is that you don't have to really explicitly focus on that thought for it to be a thought that's happening. Like I'm not focusing on every single word that I'm saying for me to say it, if that makes sense. It's like these are things that just kind of come naturally to us. I don't need to like remember physically. Okay, well, what's the word for this thing that has letters written on? Okay, that's a book. I have to say the word book. He's saying it's these natural processes that we have. That is what our unconscious thought is that enables us to make our worldview and speak and things like that.
yes, and I think that's completely irrelevant. Anyway, so what he says he studies. What is that is what I study. What exactly our unconscious system of concepts is, and how we think and talk using that system of concepts,
Hmm.
otherwise known as the English language,
Hmm.
for us in America. Anyway, so but yeah, I think I just restated it. You had an excellent summary of what he was
Thank you.
talking about. Is what he studies. So, and we talked about this briefly. He talks about using metaphors in moral
Mhm.
moral discussions, or using moral metaphors in other discussions. And he mentions conceptualizing morality in terms of financial transactions and accounting. May I be indebted to you, or I'll be repaying you the favor, and he draws the conclusion that we have these moral concepts and we're treating them as transactional. I would draw the exact opposite conclusion, is that we're describing the financial transactions using those moral terms just so that we can understand the specific obligations of one person as a party to a contract.
Hmm.
And how else are you going to describe it?
Yeah.
But in some sort of moral terms. I mean, when I teach contract law, I have to talk about obligations to fulfill the written commitments that are enforceable under law. I mean, so you're indebted to somebody, but
Hmm.
he talks about it like it's he I think he has the cause and effect reverse, but
Hmm.
he
It's
talks
almost like
about,
he's imagining that economics came before morality, and we've
correct.
developed, a way to talk about morality using the pre-existing economics, models that we have, and that's just not. Of course, we would not agree with that at all.
Right, because I mean, way back in the Stone Age, if once they were able to communicate, if you had some food and you shared it, you'd have a sense that person should share something with you.
Hmm.
There'd be an exchange. Even before you had an economic theory of anything, you'd say, okay, we'll work on this together. And if I give this to you, or I let you use my tool, then you're gonna have to give it back to me. Now you're
Hmm.
indebted to me.
Hmm.
So I don't know. But I do agree that much of moral, and he calls it more reasoning, is metaphorical reasoning. I think communicating a moral system is done through metaphors.
Hmm.
I think if you're really trying to um, flush out, what you believe and what you think is right in a moral system, using metaphors is really the best way to do it.
Hmm.
I
Yeah, I
think.
mean,
But
there's a reason Jesus, spoke in parables all the time.
yeah,
It's because it
right.
gives it, some a way for you to understand it more directly, with your own daily life and stuff like that, more applicable concepts to you.
And that dude was really, really smart.
Hmm.
The Jesus.
Yeah, no, I picked up on who you're talking about there.
And I as I get older, uh, man, that dude was impressive.
Hmm.
I mean, let's just, setting aside. I mean, he lived,
Hmm.
right. There's a guy named Jesus, the factual data and all that kind of stuff. He lived, and no matter if you believe he was God or not, man, that dude was impressive.
Hmm.
And he was just a revolutionary. Anyway, I just want to share that with our audience again, because I'm just the more you read about him, and just a real sense of who the person was based upon those readings and how devoted his followers were, must be a pretty cool cat. Anyway, um, so he talks about metaphorical common sense. I don't know how much we want to really get into this, but he does mention, like, he gives examples,
Hmm.
which show this is really where he really displays his unconscious bias,
Hmm.
because he talks about, conservative common sense versus liberal common sense, and he gives this example.
Hmm.
And I'm going to read this a little bit. It says, the logical, this is on page, what is it, 7? The logical structure of a column is determined by the metaphor, not by facts. One could have taken the same budget. So there's a story about a budget shortfall in
Hmm.
Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and the journalist phrases it as what is about to do us in is the poor but compassionate mother with a credit card, because he saw that that DC was spending too much money. There was a budget shortfall of $722 million because they've had too many social programs. Essentially, is what this journalist is saying. He's describing it as this mother's been too compassionate. That's the language he's using.
Right. And I mean, like, man, I wish we had like one journalist that would write that now. It's sort of major publications. All anyway. But I'm sorry, it's a good intro because I'm about to talk about it. He says, one could have observed that Washington, D.C. must have city services beyond its population to serve the large number of relatively well-off civil service workers, lobbyists, and others who live in the wealthy suburbs but work in town. One can also have mentioned that there's the responsibility of Congress to see the city is maintained properly and that it lives by a humane standard. Indeed, that it should set a standard for the country. I'm wondering who says this. When you have a budget and you're doing government services, what is he even talking about there?
Hmm.
It's not about the column that he gives as an example, and public policy generally is really a dispute over obviously limited resources. Okay, what are
Hmm.
your priorities? And he's talking about, well, can't we just talk about how it's an obligation that the government, that's assumed.
Hmm.
Okay, that was assumed in the column.
Yeah.
The initial column is that there is a responsibility to have government funded programs, services like roads, and bridges and a working in DC, it would be a working public transport system and all
Mhm.
that. But it's, to frame it in the way that the author suggests is to absolve mismanagement. I mean, it's not the author of the original column was not arguing, well, you shouldn't spend any money
Mhm.
on public services. He's saying it's all been mismanaged. It's like giving a credit card to some idiot that's just going to run it up and never
Yeah.
pay the bill. For
And
crying
it's
out
like he mentions that even in this excerpt, he says, the final part of the excerpt is, but then she has to learn to say no, not just to junk food, but to quality cuts of meat she can't afford. So he's even framing some services as those quality cuts of meat. There are some necessary services that the
Correct.
city has to provide, but they've been so mismanaged that now those services that are necessary, that he admits are necessary, are going to have to get a budget cut because
Yes.
of the poor spending. So he's not saying we shouldn't have any of those, like Lakoff is kind of framing it
Right.
as he's saying, well, this journalist is saying that we shouldn't have these services. That's not true. The journalist himself is acknowledging that those are necessary, that there are good things in those services.
But I think Lakoff. Thank you for that, because I think it's a
Hmm.
good point. And I think Lakoff misses his own point,
Hmm.
because he says this is a different kind of common sense. I don't think Lakoff has any common sense. I think it's a different kind of common sense in that it has no sense. You know,
Hmm.
but why on earth would you pick out as an example? You're writing this book to obviously, and he gets into this, and we'll talk about it into this episode. He's trying to convince the reader that to be a liberal,
Hmm.
right? That's
Yes.
part of the purpose of this is to first understand these crazy conservatives so that you can argue with them and
Hmm.
convince them that they're wrong. And this is why you should be a liberal too.
Hmm.
Uh, why would you give this example? This is a terrible example. That's an example of a very effective and appropriate column
Hmm.
criticizing government spending in a
Yeah.
reasonable manner. But you could have picked out a libertarian, which isn't really a conservative Republican
Hmm.
position where there shouldn't be any services.
Yeah.
You should take care of yourself, and the government shouldn't give you anything. That's not what the
Hmm.
column said. So he's using it as an example of a different kind of common sense because of course he's a socialist,
Hmm.
right? And I wish you wouldn't have told me that, because I would have wanted to guess it first. Because I basically guess now I have guessed that he's an atheist, but I don't know if
Yes.
that's true. But I have that and written in my liner here.
Hmm.
Uh, so he's talking about, well, these different types of common sense. One's liberal, one's conservative, and I think I don't know if he would even consider the conservative common sense to be valid.
Hmm.
But I don't think he actually says it's not. He certainly prefers the liberal side of it better. But anyway, back to his original point, he wants to try to figure out a way to understand these crazy gorillas in the mist,
Hmm.
why they think these weird things. It'd been better for him to have a conversation with a honest intellectual conservative.
Yeah.
But anyway, I guess he probably didn't think
There's
of
not
that.
too many of those in linguistics, so.
um, true. Yes, I guess it's hard to find them. So then he talks about these prototypes, and I
Mhm.
don't know what to make of this discussion. It seems
Yeah.
he's trying to use
He's
certain
talking about
terms to
yeah,
describe them.
categorization, which I think is an important thing to talk about. And he talks about a little bit before that, like radial categories, and that's sort of how we group concepts within our mind, and that there are variations on a central model. So essentially, he's arguing that there's no one perfect ideal thing that meets all of our criteria for what something is. He says like the category mother, our word for mother can mean either the one who gives birth to us, the female from whom you get half your genetic traits, the person who raises and nurtures you, or the wife of your father. And so there's all of these different things that we associate with mothers. But of course, if you're adopted, you would still consider someone, your mother who doesn't fit all of those categories. But we have an understanding of what, a mother is, and we have radial categories, and that there's a bunch of things that can kind of be lumped into mother that you did not necessarily like an exact one that matches all of those.
I wonder if he would affirm that part of the book now, because a mother could be your dad who's now wearing a dress and he's in his 50s and he's has sort of fetish about it. Because I'm your mother too. You have two mommies now.
Hmm.
Would he put that in his category 5? I think so. I think he
Yeah.
would. But I think it undermines this whole discussion about
Hmm.
these types of prototypes and the linguistics, because they're undermining the language itself,
Hmm.
which I actually would be kind of interested in what his take is. But if he's a
Hmm.
socialist, then he's probably on board. He's on that
Yeah.
train.
Well, because now it's devolved into just complete, circular reasoning. Once you get to the point where it's, well, we don't really necessarily have to have one thing that's tied to these categories. You don't have to really mean any of these traits. You could just say that you are this thing, and because language is so malleable, if you say that it is, you're a speaker of this language, therefore you're correct. We cannot say that you're wrong. And so I think his fifth category would also be in anyone who claims to be a mother,
Yes,
regardless of
right.
if they fit any of this. And you would apply that to any of these categories.
Yes. And the funny thing is like you sometimes you'll see like these viral clips of I don't know, it's Charles Kirk, isn't that his name?
Charlie Kirk, yeah.
Charlie Kirk, and the other Michael Knowles, and they'll
Hmm.
have like a question answer thing after their speeches, and there'll be
Hmm.
somebody that will and they'll say, "Well, define woman,"
Hmm.
and 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 they always say something. Well, this person who claims to be a woman or says they're a woman or feels they're a woman,
Hmm.
and they don't expand on it, but they always ask, well, can you define it without using the term itself, which is an element of logic and understanding and discussion. And they probably, I don't know, maybe they do it live and it's not in the clip. It's like, well, it doesn't help us to understand a concept if you're defining the concept by the concept itself.
Hmm.
You have to use something else to define it that's separate from that same term.
Hmm.
And I think people just don't even understand what they're talking. Why would I have to describe it to you not using the term woman?
Hmm.
They don't even understand why you would even be asking that because
Yeah.
they've never tried to communicate difficult concepts and they
Hmm.
don't logic. I don't know. It's
Yes.
weird. So he's got these categories: a central subcategory of radial category. This provides the basis for extending the category in new ways for defining variations. Political examples would include central types of liberals and conservatives. And there's a typical case prototype,
Mhm.
which is like, typically birds fly. Typical American, what comes to mind for many, if we talk about an American, um, if I speak of a typical American, what comes to mind for many is an adult white male Protestant. I thought that was kind of
Hmm.
interesting.
Hmm.
I guess he hangs out with a bunch of white male Protestants
Well, he
because
is a linguist.
I don't think of I don't think of religion
Hmm.
other than maybe I would say Christian,
Hmm.
but I would never say Protestant. Of
Yeah.
course, I hang out with a lot of Catholics. Damn Protestants. All right. They couldn't be perfect, so they quit.
Hmm.
Just teasing
Yes, of course.
Protestant friends. And now how perfect is your Protestant church? Heretic. Um, they've gone like all the Protestant churches have gone so lefty haywire.
Yeah.
Oh, I feel so bad for them.
Hmm.
I mean, like, could you imagine being a devout,
Hmm.
whatever? I mean, like Methodist or like the Anglican Church. They're
Yeah.
crazy. They're
Well,
just crazy.
I see that sometimes with people, talking about religion online or whatever. The Protestants are like, look how far, the Catholic Church has fallen. Pope Francis said this about gay people, and then you'll see somebody in the comments like, "What denomination are you?" And like, "Well, I'm actually of, this council of this subgroup because we disagree with them on this thing because they approved of this first and blah blah blah." And so they're like this tiny little minute group that's split off of this other group because they disagreed with because their original group said something that they didn't like anyway, whether it's like
Yeah.
female pastors or gay marriage or something like that, and they've already split off from that, but they used to be a part of that. And it's like, well, you can't say that the Catholic Church is doing so bad when you yourself have split off into your own tiny little denomination now at this point as well.
Yeah, and I think my biggest objection to any Protestant religion,
Hmm.
where and I don't remember which one it is, but it's a subcategory of Baptists. I just am offended that they are against alcohol at wedding receptions. I mean, come on. And some of them,
Sounds
no
like you're speaking
dancing.
from experience.
Yes, I've been to
Do
been
you,
to
do you have a bad,
well, you hear a pin drop in the place. You're just sitting around drinking iced tea, not even sweet tea. You put the sugar in it, I guess. But it's like, I mean, it's fine. You
Mhm.
might as well have it at 10 a.m. or something. I mean, who goes out for? I mean, I don't. You can have a good time without alcohol.
Yes.
But I mean, a wedding reception where you have none, and I'm just like, wait a second, didn't you read the part where he made the water into the wine? For Christ's sake,
Oh,
literally,
yeah,
literally.
exactly. But
Anyway,
yeah, back to the book. He talks about the central subcategory, which says we can extend the category in new ways. He says the typical case, we have a typical example of something.
yes.
And then going on for there, there's an
Ideal.
ideal case. We have some idea of what an ideal should be, an anti-ideal, the opposite of what we expect. He says a social stereotype, which is different. It says widespread in a culture for making snap judgments without reflective thought about an entire category by virtue of suggesting that the stereotype is the typical case. So he differentiates stereotype from typical case in that regard.
And wait a
Yes,
second, I want to interrupt
yes.
right now because he uses the common stereotype that everybody can use where he wouldn't be brave enough to use something else,
Hmm.
some other, racial stereotypes. Examples include the drunken Irishman.
Hmm.
Huh. I just gave my heartfelt as a partly Irish Catholic about having alcohol.
Hmm.
I've walked right into that stereotype.
Hmm.
Anyway,
And
but
then he also,
everybody can use that. Everybody can use that stereotype. Oh, the
yes,
drunken Irishman. Why don't you
yes.
be brave and put a different one on there?
Oh, he does also say the industrious Japanese. But again, that's like a positive one, so it's not even a negative thing. It's like expecting, that the Japanese to be hardworking in some
They
capacity.
are.
Yes.
Oh my God, they are. I mean, I don't know any Japanese. I
Yes.
just know the stereotype. But
Yes. He also mentions the a salient exemplar, which is like a single memorable example that you have in mind when you think about a particular category. It doesn't necessarily have to be the typical or the ideal. It's just something that comes to mind, one particular case.
and
And
what
then
he
this,
uses, of course, is this was huge in the 90s. This was written in the 90s, right?
mhm, yeah.
The single welfare cheater to suggest everyone on welfare cheats. And it's not that whole discussion was there. It was, I mean, it's terrible now,
Hmm.
but the problem was then is that welfare had always been up to that point like a safety net rather than a safety couch or so,
Hmm.
safety net or something. And so there's a big discussion, and Bill Clinton triangulated and joined with the Republican Congress when he was president and passed welfare reform and balanced the budget. So it
Hmm.
was Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, of all
Yeah.
people, did welfare reform, and the liberals hated it. And
Hmm.
it had certain work requirements. So you had to either be working or seeking work. And you had to do, jump through some hoops to get this, and it would end at some point. But so they hated that. And they said,
Hmm.
well, you're just demonizing all these people. No, we're not. We're just trying to reform out of control spending because there's a lot of people that are taking advantage of it if you
Hmm.
don't have some sort of requirements.
Well,
So
it's the exact argument now that you're seeing with illegal immigration is saying, well, not everybody who comes here legally is going to, to violently harm someone. You need to stop pointing out these violent crime statistics because that's racist to these people. Well, no, it's saying that we should reform the immigration system. It doesn't say that everyone who's coming across the border is a horrible, terrible person, but it is saying that we should have measures in place to make sure that's a safe system, that it's working effectively.
yeah, I think there's going to be such a backlash. It's going to make welfare reform in the 90s pale in comparison.
Hmm.
And I really do think that at some point soon, if a Republican gets into office in 2025, there will be people shot at the border trying to cross it.
Hmm.
Hopefully it'll be the military age men who are acting as what they call them coyotes. But I mean, I think it's gonna swing so far back the other way.
Yeah.
Now, whether or not they will follow Polk's example, the second greatest president of the United States, and invade Mexico,
Mm.
I don't know. But why not?
Who do you think
I
is
don't
the greatest president? I thought
know,
for a
George
long time you
Washington.
thought.
No,
I thought
George
for a long.
Washington
Oh, okay.
is always the best
Hmm.
because he made all the rest possible,
Hmm.
and he's the only leader that I know of that did an excellent job and was very popular when leaving office. Could have been made king
Hmm.
and walked away and went back to his farm, literally. I
Yeah.
mean, is there anybody else in history that had didn't done that?
Not that I know of.
There's no national leader of any country that I know of
Hmm.
that at the height of his or her power walked away and went back to the farm and could have been king,
There
literally.
was a an ancient Roman dictator, because dictator had a different meaning back then. Dictator was an emergency power granted to someone, could only last for up to 6 months, and essentially like kind of waived a lot of like the restrictions on power in the existing system. There's a famous emperor or famous dictator, sorry, not emperor. This is before the empire, still in the republic, who was called up to be dictator, super popular. There was some sort of crisis. I think it was a military crisis. He led like the armies essentially. He fixed things within like 2 weeks and then went back to farming on his cabbage farm immediately after that. So it has happened in very rare
You
circumstances.
have to give me that person's name because I'll be
I think that was
interested.
Cincinnatus, who
Oh, really?
Cincinnati's named after. I think it's Cincinnatus.
I have to learn more about him.
Or
Now,
the Cincinnatus. Yeah.
Polk was a compromise candidate in the convention, and he promised to serve only one term. And
Hmm.
they tried to get him to run for a second term. He said, "No, I promise I'm only going to do one term." And he
Yeah.
did one term, period. And then he didn't. I don't think he lived too long after that. He really wore himself out. Workaholic.
Hmm.
He was like a Japanese.
But yeah, no, it was Cincinnatus. An invasion prompted his fellow citizens to call for his leadership. He assumed complete control over the state, but upon achieving a swift victory in only 16 days, relinquished his power and its prerequisites and returned to his farm. His success and immediate
Yeah,
resignation of his near absolute authority with the end of the crisis has often been cited, blah, 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 blah.
16 days. I don't know. He didn't even move his bed in there. I don't know if that counts. Washington was there for 8 years. Yeah, I think it's a big difference. You know,
Yeah,
if he
yeah,
came
no,
in
that's
as a
true.
temp, he came in as a temp. He left as a temp.
That is true. That is
Now
true.
he didn't credit him for keeping his temp job as temporary, but uh, I mean, I'm not critical of him, but I don't know. I still think Washington's awesome.
All
Anyway,
right.
so where are we at?
Oh,
So the social stereotype. We
yes, we
talked
talked
about
about that. We talked about salient
evil.
exemplar. And then the final one was the essential prototype, a hypothesized collection of properties that, according to commonplace folk theory, characterizes what makes a thing the kind of thing it is, or what makes a person the kind of person he is. So, birds have feathers, wings, and beaks, and lay eggs, et cetera, et cetera. So the seven that he's looking at here, again, just to re-summarize, essential subcategory is saying that we have a category that can be extended. Typical case, saying that you can point to particular things and say that's a typical version of that. An ideal case, some sort of idea of what something should be. An anti-ideal, the opposite of that. Social stereotype, quick snap judgments without reflective thought. Salient exemplar, one particular instance that sort of a lot of people take to be a typical example. And then the essential, which is usually what we think of kind of like the Platonic ideal of what a thing is, all of the things that something has to make it that thing, if that makes sense.
Yes, good summary and good descriptions.
Thank you.
So then the author, do you want to talk about that anymore?
No, that's all right. That's all right.
The author has the next little section of this chapter is the present book. He gives us kind of a synopsis. Okay, what is he planning on doing? What is this book about?
Mm-hmm.
I have written next to this the gorillas in the mist description because he says the book came out of his research around the time of the conservatives' victory in 1994 elections. That's the
Mm-hmm.
elections. So I would have been 24. So I was a young man, but I remember that time. I was not. I don't know if I would even say I was conservative then.
Mm-hmm.
But it was an interesting time, and it was the 90s tech bubble. The economy was doing great. Bill Clinton had been, let's see, he got impeached what year? So he got elected originally in 92.
Mm-hmm.
And then he got reelected in 96 because when the conservatives won the House, I'm trying to remember if they won the Senate too. I think they did. And that's when he and Dick Morris, if you ever hear that guy,
I know the name.
he's a columnist, and I think he might have at some point been a Trump advisor. But he was really the helped the Clintons, plural, with their triangulation political theories of well, let's just act like we're Republicans on a lot of major issues
Yeah.
because how are they going to vote against us?
Mm-hmm.
Throw us out. It was very smart. But anyway, so he says, after that election, I guess he was just so stunned. It kind of reminds me of the Trump election in 16, where people, how did this even happen?
Yeah.
How do these conservatives win the House in 1994?
Well, there's some great clips of a couple different journalists saying, "Well, I don't know how Trump won. I don't know a single person who voted for Trump." Well, it's like, yeah, of course you don't. That says more about you than about, the election of the president.
Well, I think I had mentioned that was originally spoken back in Nixon's election, but it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
on video. But there's a lot of people saying that in columns, like how is he even able to who even likes this person? They
He
hate
was like
it.
one of the most popular elections of all time, right? Didn't he
His
win
reelection,
49 out of 50? Yeah, re-election, I guess. Yeah.
his reelection was a huge landslide, and I'll have to revisit my thoughts on Watergate
Hmm.
That's what destroyed him was the Watergate investigation. Of course, he ended up resigning.
Hmm.
And then we had huge Democratic uh, victories in the 70s, which
Hmm.
ultimately resulted in Carter and a bunch
Yep.
of well, and like Teddy Kennedy was very popular at the time. That was after he murdered that gal in the DWI accident. But I guess I'd say manslaughter. But then they were so terrible, they so overreached that the Reagan Revolution came in 1980. So anyway,
Yeah.
so back to our thing. He does make the he says, well, that surprise to
Hmm.
him.
Yes.
He didn't call it a surprise, but the conservatives' victory in '94, it became clear to him. He says it became clear to me that the liberals and conservatives have very different moral systems, and I think that's just really, really true. And the funny thing is, he doesn't want to really explore what's wrong with the liberal point of view. He wants to figure out what is kooky conservatives thinking.
Hmm.
And so he asserts in the next page 12, conservatives, as we shall see, is based on a strict father model, while liberalism is centered around a nurturant parent model.
Hmm.
These two models of the family give rise to different moral systems and different discourse forms, that is, different choices of words and different modes of reasoning. And I think there's some truth to that. I mean, if you look at the way that the programs are described, I just think, and I think part of it is that the socialists, like Mr. Lakoff, always want to hide what their
Hmm.
ultimate goals are in this nurturant parent model, as opposed to the conservatives sometimes are stupidly saying, well, this is what we want to do, and this is
Hmm.
what we're going to do.
Yeah.
And when you do that, you're going to lose the voters who don't want you to do that stuff.
Yeah.
So in some ways, and of course, if there's not like maybe a liberal listening to this, but they may say, well, conservatives lie and all that kind of stuff, which they do, um, but I think he's right in his description of how the conservatives and liberals look at the government and the role government plays and
Hmm.
how they communicate that to the people.
Well,
So
well, I
I
think
think
he's doing exactly that in this book. This is something especially with, journalists and a lot of academics, but he says, I found that using analytic techniques from cognitive linguistics, I could describe the moral systems of both conservatives and liberals in considerable detail, et cetera, et cetera. But he's framing it, very much framing it like, well, this is just, dry, hard evidence. This is just an analytical model that I'm using. These are the principles. But he's already assuming a lot of things in performing that analysis. He's already assuming a very liberal perspective on this. He's already taking on, an idea, kind of what you were mentioning, that we have to figure out why the conservatives think like this. And so he's presenting it as if it's just the evidence, just this analytical stuff. There's no bias here, as he's kind of said throughout. I'm saving my bias for the end for what I think is best. But clearly, that's just not where he's coming from at all.
right. Well, and you can see that from his discussions. Like he says, consider conservatism. What does opposition to abortion have to do with opposition to environmentalism?
Hmm.
Well, it depends on what you mean by environmentalism, because there's a huge overlap with conservation efforts
Hmm.
and anti-abortion thought, because even if you just stick with the Bible, the people that talk about we're stewards of the birds and the beasts and everything else. That's in the Bible, as is, thou shalt not kill. So
Hmm.
that's, but to say that you're opposed to environmentalism depends on what you mean by environmentalism. Is
Hmm.
it some whack job that wants to regulate every single little pond across the United States as part of the Clean Water Act? Um, well, that's what Obama administration wanted to do. If you had a puddle on your farm, they wanted to expand the federal government's interest and regulation on your farm.
Hmm.
That's environmentalism, I guess, but that's a crazy public policy to even think of. And so he comes with the assumption that conservatives are opposed to environmentalism,
Hmm.
and they're not opposed to conservation efforts
Hmm.
and environmental efforts, clean air, clean water, all that stuff.
Hmm.
So he frames everything so um, in such a false way
Hmm.
to impugn the motives of the conservatives. So it already rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, I think.
why do you say that? But he's not speaking to me. He's speaking to what he presumes to be a liberal
Mhm.
audience.
Yeah, well, going back to what you said, about the Bible, I think that's something that's really going to hurt him here in his, very analytical study, is the subject of religion, not just because there's a lot of people out there that say, well, I think this way just because the Bible says so, but by being religious, you inherently believe in some sort of higher truth, some sort of higher standard for things. And if you're coming at this saying, well, all thought, all reasoning, all morality is based on this unconscious, unreal sort of thing, then he's already not going to be able to fully understand what is, more commonly among conservatives, religious belief, that there is
Yeah.
something higher, because he's just saying, well, it's all unconscious. There's no real thing out there. He's kind of setting that as one of his premises, and he's just not going to be able to understand a lot of religious reasoning in that way.
Yeah, I wonder if he's going to be able to deal with later in later chapters people that change,
Hmm.
that change their views. Like I used to be, well, I don't know if I was ever liberal, but I was definitely not conservative.
Hmm.
Over the course of my life, now this is 30 years. But how does he figure that has even happened? If I
Hmm.
have this unconscious bias because I grew up in a well, it was a uh, Reagan Democrat family at the
Hmm.
time. But then he talks about, like even the like on 13, even the basics of conservative liberal discourse require explanation. Conservatives argue that social safety nets are immoral. Who says that? Okay. Because they work against self-discipline and responsibility. There is not, even back in the 90s, there was nobody, I mean, nobody
Hmm.
that was a conservative that was saying we shouldn't have safety nets.
Hmm.
That was not uttered by any conservatives that I know of. Certainly no successful national figures.
Hmm.
You would have libertarians, and libertarians still say that.
Hmm.
Libertarians are just really pot smoking leftists that don't want the government to do anything. But in event, but then he says, well, liberals argue that tax cuts for the wealthy are immoral because they help people who don't need help and
Hmm.
don't help people who do need help, which I think that is true. That's what that they think, because they don't think that the taxes are us taking money from people.
Hmm.
That's what I mean, that there's some fundamental disagreements about the nature of government.
Yeah.
And I think I think he has good points about how people talk, liberals and conservatives view government role and how they communicate that role. But the fundamental difference is how we intellectually believe what we intellectually believe is the role of government in society. I mean, I think that's going to be probably a theme through this entire book, because
Hmm.
he misses that point and he thinks we're like automatons
Automaton.
that we're programmed like you were
Hmm.
talking about. And then we're just going to put this stuff into our computer and it's going to spit out whatever our beliefs are consistent with that those strong father figure versus the mother figure. But you can be a nurturing person on the
Hmm.
conservative side and say, well, yeah, but why are the top 1%? I mean, I don't know what the statistic is, but the top 1% of our in income are paying like probably 30% of our taxes. I mean, it's
Hmm.
crazy figures. And why is that fair? What do
Yeah.
liberals think of that? But they don't view it as them paying. They view tax cuts as we're giving that money to people as
Yeah.
opposed to we're letting them keep it.
Yeah.
So
Well,
anyway,
well,
so
kind of on the topic of, things, us being automatons and stuff like that. There's a great clip. I'm forgetting the guy's name. You might have seen videos of him, but he's an older guy who goes around on college campuses and talks about Christianity.
oh, he's
And
the preacher guy,
yeah, the
and
preacher guy.
he gets screamed at sometimes, and it's
Yeah, gets screamed at. Like, I'm sure, I think he's
pretty
some sort
calm,
of,
cool, collected.
yeah,
Yeah,
calm. Yeah. But one of my favorite clips that I saw of him, is that there was somebody saying, well, nobody, your religion can't be real because it's all just ingrained into you by your family. You're not actually making that choice. It's all just, based on what your mom tells you is good, what your dad tells you is good, and that's just what you accept. And so then
yeah,
he asked this girl, he says, okay, well, were you raised religious? And she says, yeah, I was raised, Catholic or something. He says, okay, so clearly that's not how religion works, because if it was just because what was passed on to you, you would still be Catholic. You made that decision. Your religion is a choice of choosing what to believe in and things like that. And it's just like, clearly when you put it like that, not everything is just this unconscious, whatever's ingrained into us, because we have that ability, we have that free will to choose other things.
yeah. And every time I see those kind of interactions with people, and they're pretty entertaining. That I don't know if you see that Billboard Chris guy who just says, we shouldn't be giving children. His billboard says something like children can't consent to puberty blockers, and they'll go to like Berkeley's campus.
Hmm.
He doesn't. He's not rude. He's a really nice guy. to everybody, videotapes everything, and then he'll have discussions with people. And anyway, so we had somebody that used to work in our office that had those goats, they're called fainting goats.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of, I almost half expect people like that to just like glitch and then fall over, because like that guy saying like she was asserting something that in her own personal experience was contradicted by her own personal
Mm-hmm.
experience. And had she never thought of that counter argument? I mean, how do they not even, how do they glitch out like
Mm-hmm.
that? They don't even understand the um, basic
Mm-hmm.
logic.
Well, I
Just
think
really weird to me.
it's coming from, I think the same standpoint that Lakoff is coming from, and also the same standpoint that you see a lot of communists coming from, where it's like, well, of course, all of the lesser people are still under this trap of religion or under this trap of capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. But I, am one of the few enlightened ones who's been able to work past that, and I can now say, well, look at you poor, stupid people who are still, just believing what's been ingrained into you. You are the
Um,
automatons. I'm the only, free thinking one. He's kind of doing the
yeah.
same thing with the conservatives are stuck here, but I'm one of the analytical, liberals here who's able to look at them and examine what's really going on.
Yeah, yeah, you're probably right. It's like that whole I'm the hero of my
Hmm.
own story thing. I
Yeah.
can't be the villain
Yes.
uh, of my own life, but a
Hmm.
lot of us are. I
Yes.
mean, we all are someday or another. We
Hmm.
were all sinners. We all made mistakes. Anyway, so
Back to the book.
his bottom line is, it kind of says it pretty succinctly, 13. The answers, I will argue, come from the differences in their models of the family and the family-based morality from the distinction between what I call the strict father and the nurturant parent models.
Hmm.
That's what he's saying is his conclusion. Now he's going to go through, I guess some sort of analysis to try to
Hmm.
figure that out. And of course, I view that as the government. The liberal view is the government is like your parent,
Hmm.
and the conservative view is the government is your servant.
Hmm.
You know, and if I expect that everything he says about the language that people use are going to be consistent with those two outlooks about the government
Hmm.
as opposed to about your morality.
Yeah.
Because if you take the morality out of it and you just look at what your view of what the government's role is, you're going to get these same results probably.
Hmm.
Because if you think the government is like your parent and should provide all this stuff for you, you're going to be a liberal. If you
Hmm.
think the government is your servant and should be provided services based upon, what's best for the community, what's most effective, you're going to be conservative.
Hmm.
But anyway,
Yeah.
so he
Um,
talks about, I'm sorry, you had something else?
I was just gonna kind of move on here because I think these next couple sections don't need too much to touch on. He says talks about variation. He says, of course, not every conservative is going to fit into the same mold. Not every liberal is, but we can kind of put together some sort of base, common framework.
I
That's
do
what he
want
says.
to I do want to say one thing. He
Hmm.
gives examples of two divergent conservative thinkers as Bob Dole and Phil Graham. And anybody my age knows that there's no difference between Bob Dole and Phil Graham appreciably. They were not very conservative. Phil Graham was like he's like a flat taxer guy.
Hmm.
That was his thing. Low taxes, free trade. And Bob Dole was just a middle of the road climber. He
Hmm.
just wanted to go to the next role. He ran for president, lost. Phil Graham ran for president and lost to the primary, I think
Hmm.
a couple of times. But I just, he gives the examples. These are not people that disagree with anything each
Yeah.
other said. I mean, it's just, anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's kind of, what I was saying here. Because then he goes on, he talks about coherence. Well, we know there's variation, but clearly we have to have a coherent political ideology. And he does make a good point that, people don't just bounce between completely different worldviews. Typically people do have a coherent worldview that they fit all of their issues into. They're not saying, at this point in time, I'm going to believe that there is no free will, but at this point in time, I'm going to believe that there is free will. It's you don't really often do that. They find a way of incorporating most things into one coherent system.
Is that you saying that, or you're saying that he says that?
He says that.
Yeah. Do you think that's true?
It depends. I think a lot of people are able to do that, but I think there are definitely cases where people just don't have any idea of how two things relate to each other, and do jump between very different worldviews.
I've come to the conclusion that most people don't actually think, like, wait a second. I don't, I'm not stopping there.
Yes,
Don't
that's the
think
end of the
through.
sentence.
No, don't really think through. Well, wait, if I believe this about, well, well, hey, I'm going to mention the pandemic. The pro-choice people being so pro-vaccine. That
Mm-hmm.
doesn't make any logical sense. My body, and the conservatives are kind of rubbing in their salt in their wound, saying, "Well, my body, my choice. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
going to take the experimental vaccine. Don't you believe in that anymore? No, we just want to kill babies." Um, but I don't think a lot of people like. I think you and I think there's a lot. I think well, I said put this way. I think a lot of people do, and they
Mm-hmm.
try to figure out. Wait a second, how does this fit in with all my other views? I want to be consistent and rational and make sure that my principles, I have first principles and things flow from that. And how does this fit in? Like how does like for me, how does the just war theory fit in? How does the death penalty fit in with my positions on abortion? So do they?
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of people do, but I think there's a lot of people that don't think about systems. Like out of all my views, I think a lot of people just think they feel it. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I feel like this is right. And so I think that's why there's so many swing voters because
Yeah.
you can convince them that a position is right or wrong depending on how you frame it. It's like a
Mm-hmm.
lot of jurors. Like if you're in a jury trial, it's not as important of an issue, but you can convince a lot of them depending on how you present the evidence.
Yeah.
And the same 12 people will come to a different conclusion depending on how you present the evidence and instruct them in the law and all that kind of stuff. But
Mm-hmm. Well,
um,
I think a lot of the problem also now is sort of just with how people label different things. Like a lot of people, will read an article, essentially their first principle is I am against bad things. And
mm,
it's very easy for journalists or academics to say, well, this concept is bad because it's rooted in the ideas of this one historical figure, and he said this was bad, and et cetera, et cetera. And says, oh, well, that's bad, and so I have to agree that this is bad, and that is something that I hate. And they don't look any farther than that into to any other ideas about that topic. You see a lot of that with like so-called sexist and racist language and stuff like that, where it's like, well, this comes from this place and therefore it's wrong because it was used by these people this time to mean this thing. It's like, okay, well, that must apply to this modern sense of how we use this word, therefore it's bad. I was looking at an article, I don't know if you heard about this, but Hillary Clinton and Malala Yousafzai produced a Broadway musical about the suffragettes. And I was reading this article, and it said it's about the suffragists. And then in parentheses, you're not supposed to say suffragettes anymore. This is like an NBC article or something like you're not supposed to say suffragettes anymore. It's considered sexist. And that's the whole explanation they give. I'm like, what is it? What does that mean? What are you talking about? Suffragettes is sexist. And I looked up sort of the history of the word, and there is technically a distinction between suffragettes and suffragists. Suffragettes was more commonly used for the British women. Suffragist was used for the American women. And so there is a historical distinction. And evidently, the suffragettes, there was also a distinction within Britain where, like, there was ets versus ists, and the ets were like arsonists or something. There was something else going on there, where they were like a more violent wing in and of themselves. But it had nothing to do with the gender of the women. It had nothing to do with that. But now this article is saying, well, suffragettes is sexist now, and it's completely removing any of the actual historical reasoning behind these words, and it's just labeling this is wrong, and you have to acknowledge that this is wrong. I'm like, what? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I don't know why these people that want to praise women that want to defeminize the language
Mm-hmm.
make any sense to me.
Yeah.
And this whole trans thing is just wonderful to watch. How they're destroying Title IX,
Mm-hmm.
which is inherently unfair to men.
Yeah.
Uh, because it requires the same number of scholarships and same
Mm-hmm.
some equality in programs in sports programs when nobody wants to watch them.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, but in any event, so anyways, there's a lot of good to Title IX, but the transgender thing where guys can just say, oh, I'm a chick. And I just saw a video today about some guy that set a new school record in the 200 dash, and if it was at least 400 meters, he might have been able to lap him. Uh, but he was so far ahead, he was running at double the speed.
Uh,
Um, and the guy probably, it's like, well, like, what it was jarring for me when I went to my first cross country meet.
mm-hmm.
And I did not know because like I ran 5Ks,
Mm-hmm.
I've run some trail runs, and there's a lot of women at my level that will be faster than me, especially now,
Mm-hmm.
that old and all that stuff. But even my age group and all these things, there are women that can run as fast as me
Mm-hmm.
commonly,
Yeah.
and so it was really jarring to me to see high school athletics where, well, at the time, I could run a cross country meet faster than the vast majority of the top female results.
Mm-hmm.
in those cross country meets. As at that time was I 40 something, and I'm like, wait a second, this is wild. It's the same distance, and so that really got me thinking, like, well, why do they have separate sports? Well, it's because if you don't have separate sports, they can't compete,
Hmm.
at the highest level. And the fact that feminists are even tolerating any of these dudes to
Hmm.
come in to destroy their sports and to destroy what they have built, which is really wonderful, especially for young girls and young women to be able to have those opportunities, get athletic scholarships. And now some dude can just, because I was thinking, you know what? Why don't we put Adam in a dress and he's gonna clear the field?
Yeah.
I mean, you're gonna be you would have been you were not competitive. I mean, sorry to
Hmm.
say, you
No,
were not
it's,
competitive at the highest level in that class at the
hmm.
state meet. Well, of course, you ran a bad race, but
Yes,
anyway,
it was
don't want to
horrible.
bring up
Yes.
bad memories. But if you ran your best race,
Hmm.
you would have been a medalist for
Yeah.
sure, I would think.
Because I was down
Um,
to about 17 and a half, and that would
yeah,
have gotten me, a place in the podium within the girls' meets. I would have been nowhere close for the
sure.
men. I was not
Yes,
as good of a runner as many of those people were.
right.
But it's
Well,
like,
you
yeah,
didn't train as hard either. I mean,
exactly,
the
exactly.
program that you had, wouldn't have supported
Hmm.
that kind of outcome. I don't think. But
Yes,
anyway,
yeah. But yeah, no, it's what I was saying. It's, even, but, compared to the people on my team, we're running the same places, running the same things and practices and stuff like
yes,
that. And,
right,
it's just, I was faster.
right.
The men were stronger, were faster, just on average.
And you had some good, talented runners on
Hmm.
female runners at that
Hmm.
school at the
Yes.
time, including a state champion, I
Hmm.
think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was jarring to me, and I just don't
But when, and
understand
she
why
got
they
it.
wanted. Go
Mhm.
ahead.
And that same person got, I can't remember if it was track or cross country, but she got a scholarship to compete
That's right.
in
Yeah.
college. But if I had decided that I was a woman, I would have then been the most eligible person, for
Right.
for that scholarship to go to that university. If they would have accepted me, as a woman and just completely
Yeah.
taken her spot, and, a spot that she deserved.
And I didn't understand why the girls line up. I mean, when you see this dude, why are they even competing against this dude? They
Hmm.
should all just say, no, fuck it, we'll
Yeah.
forfeit.
Yeah.
And then that's what's going to end it. I don't understand why the parents of these girls, and I guess they're well, but she's, she's a good enough runner. She might get a scholarship. If she forfeits, she's not going to have the records. Well, at some point, somebody's got to step up.
Hmm.
Somebody's got to make the sacrifice. Somebody's got to take the bullet, and if all of them do it,
Hmm.
then it's going to end. But you don't see any collective effort to say, no, we're not lining up with this dude. Oh, you're a bigot. What are you talking about? That's a dude.
Yeah.
He's 6'2". Um, and he was running the guy's meet last week. It's a slight exaggeration. It'll be last year,
Yeah.
And he was middle of the pack, and
Hmm.
now everybody's praising him. He's number one. He's getting medals. What the hell
Hmm.
is that?
Yeah.
I don't know. Anyway, so I don't know how we got on that thing, but we did. But I do want to say that he makes a good point that um, on 16, because people do not use the same models in all aspects of their lives, a political conservative could very well use the nurturant parent model in his family life, but not his political life. Just as a political liberal could use a strict father morality in his family life, but not the nurturant parent model in his political life. I think it's very true, especially when they're talking about their kids' achievement.
Hmm.
They understand merit with
Hmm.
their kids, but they liberals do, but they'll have a whole different attitude towards how we want to treat everybody else's kids. But then he says, the next two paragraphs down, there's no logical contradiction between the use of one model as the basis of actual family life and the use of another as a basis of one's politics. I think there is a logical contradiction.
Hmm.
I think if I think you should run your house, your political views should be consistent with your personal views and how
Hmm.
you handle yourself. And I think there is a contradiction. If it's good enough for you, why isn't it good enough for everybody else?
Hmm.
That's the whole argument about school choice. Like, well, if it's good enough for you to your kid to go to a private school, why don't you aren't you okay with funding for somebody else's kid to go to private parochial school or
Hmm.
whatever? Well, that's different because I can afford it. It's my kids and it's private. Well, but why are you against it for everybody else to get the subsidy? So
Hmm.
I think he misses that point, but
Hmm.
any of it. So he talks about he's got what 6 different things that what is explained
Hmm.
uh, Do we want to go through that real quick? Classifications, blah, blah, blah,
Yeah, he
blah.
says classification is relatively boring, so this would be an exciting thing to run through. He says the models of classification analyze modes of reasoning. Second, they show how modes of reasoning about different issues fit together. Third, they show how different forms of, say, conservative reasoning are related to each other in such a way that they're understood to be instances of conservatism. Fourth, the models show the links between forms of political reasoning and forms of moral reasoning. Fifth, the models show how moral reasoning in politics is ultimately based on models of the family. And six, there must be an explanation of why the models fit together as they do, and therefore why we don't merely have random forms of political reasoning. He says that's essentially what this book tries to do. Lay out those six things, so that they all make sense, are all coherent in that way.
And then just next sentence almost is cognitive science is in itself apolitical. Yeah, are you crazy? Yeah, whatever. Not for this guy.
Yeah.
But then he talks about his personal commitments, which I do appreciate,
Hmm.
where he discloses he's a liberal or he's
Hmm.
on the left. And he says, I hope we'll be independent of any political prejudice. So I do appreciate him putting
Hmm.
that out there, and he's
Yes.
trying. So I mean, that's all we can hope and expect of people. I don't think he seems to be trying too hard in chapter 1, where he's defaming us, um, but he says, I will give some reasons for why I'm a liberal, reasons based not on liberal ideology itself, but on external considerations. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, then he talks about an agenda that, if carried out, I believe would destroy much of the moral progress made in the 20th century. You know, so he's talking about conservatives in those apocalyptic terms in the very next paragraph, where he's saying he's trying to keep this out of the book.
Hmm.
And then he says, if we don't understand them and we let them do this, they're going to destroy all the moral progress made in the 20th century. What moral progress has been made in the 20th century? I mean, really, was there moral progress in the 20th century? I don't. I guess with get rid of segregation for
Hmm.
sure. I guess, yeah, because then you'd be talking about the women's right to vote,
Hmm.
and at this point they didn't have gay marriage because President Clinton was against gay marriage, as was Hillary at
So
the
he must
time, very
be
publicly.
when he's saying that undoing the moral progress. I guess he's assuming that conservatives are trying to take away the right for women to vote. I guess if we're undoing all
Yeah,
of the moral progress, which is just
right.
kind of an insane, assumption to be making there.
But I don't know what those are those moral? I guess you could say those are moral. That's moral progress.
Hmm.
But yeah, like, so then what's going to be undone? Those
Hmm.
actual things, or are we talking about just being a good
Hmm.
person?
Yeah,
It's
because
a
I'm
weird
trying to
thing for him to
think.
say.
What moral sort of philosophy even emerged within the 20th century that, even a liberal could get behind. And I guess really the only thing I can think of is just a move away from organized religion. That'd
Yeah,
probably be the biggest like moral philosophy, saying that you don't need, a consistent hierarchy. It's all just up to whatever you want to do, sort of the vague spirituality. That would be the biggest sort of moral philosophy happening in the 20th century. And so he's saying, this moral apocalypse that's happening is just conservatives saying that we should probably still have religion. Like that's not
yeah.
an apocalypse. I don't think that's not, undoing all of the moral progress. I don't know.
And
It's
so,
just it's strange.
yeah, and he makes this argument how important it is to read this book if you're a liberal.
Hmm.
He says if liberals do not concern themselves very seriously and very quickly with the unity of their own philosophy and with morality and the family, they will not merely continue to lose elections, but will as well bear responsibility for the success of conservatives in turning back the clock on progress in America.
Hmm.
What's he talking about? In the 1990s, the big issue was welfare reform in 1994. There were some crime bills that were supported by Biden,
Hmm.
where he was making really outrageous statements about, super. No, I think it was Hillary that talked about super predators, but really stuff that it would embarrass a Democrat to say today.
Hmm.
But then he kind of continues the next paragraph. He says they have. He talks about conservatives.
Hmm.
The politics is not just about policy and interest groups. He says they have over 25 years managed to forge conceptual links in the voter's mind between morality and public policy. I don't think that's just 25 years. That's from
Hmm.
the beginning of this republic.
Yeah.
For crying out loud, does he
It's
not
from the
any
beginning,
of time?
of any sort of
Government.
thinking about politics. You go back to Plato, right? And he's talking about the moral reasons to have, each sort of government and where the moral failings are, and each type of government. That is something that is in the core of political thinking from the
Yeah.
beginning. It's not conservatives are saying, because this is a problem. I know we've talked about this before, but with sort of taking the idea of separation of church and state to be a separation of morality from anything, saying that you
Yeah.
can't put moral reasoning onto anything. That's your own religion, that's your own personal beliefs, and that's sort of what he's seeing here. He's sort of taking that idea to be you can't have any moral reasons for anything. They're trying to force morality in here. No, morality has always been a part of public policy. It's a very moral concept because it's
Yes.
about what is right and wrong for the state and for the people of the state. That is inherently what it is about.
Yes. Crazy. And I have written in the margin, it's always been,
Yeah.
just like you said, it's crazy. So I don't know if we don't want to belabor that, but he talks about let's see, the next page, he's got the term liberal
Hmm.
talks about, as opposed to the classical liberals, which
Hmm.
is a whole different concept, which is more like what we consider,
Hmm.
conservatives in our country.
Yeah.
It talks about social contract theory of a just society and this philosopher John Rawls about the veil of ignorance. I don't know if you want to talk about that,
Yeah,
but
I
maybe.
think what's more important is what he says on page 21. This is what I call political liberalism, as compared to what the political philosophy of liberalism is just characterizes the cluster of political positions supported by people called liberals. So support for social programs, environmentalism, public education, equal rights for women's, gays, and ethnic minorities, affirmative action, pro-choice position on abortion, and so on. So he's saying, just liberalism when he's talking about it is just sort of these core concepts. So what do liberals think?
Yeah.
So sort of a circular definition, but it works fine, I think, for the purposes of this.
Well, yeah, and I mean, it's not. He doesn't define it as a political philosophy,
Mhm.
which I think is weird. It's
Yeah.
just this cluster of particular positions on these issues. It seems weird definition for a book about moral concepts of involved in politics. But um,
Mhm.
anyway, so he says, does modern theoretical liberalism in any form provide an accurate account of what political liberalism is? I think not. What the hell? You don't even think there's some any sort of theory of how it all joins together, and he doesn't think so. But anyway,
Yes.
but he says on the next page he says, nor did I use either intellectual tools or forms of reasoning of political philosophers in this book. Obviously, he's not going to use any of that stuff in this book. And then he gives us an outline, which is helpful. I
Mhm.
like that I do like that he's saying, well, this is what I'm going to do, and I do really appreciate
Mhm.
him trying on some level to keep his politics out of it, but he's obviously not doing a good job. But then he says at the end of this, chapters 21 through 23
Mhm.
provide three reasons for being a liberal, basically. For being reasons for being a liberal. Many other reasons might be adduced and have been, but I bring up three that come from my field of research and adjacent field research on child development, the nature of mind, and the internal structure of moral conceptual systems.
Mm.
And then finally, in the epilogue, I discuss problems for public discourse in the media that are revealed by this book. And at the very end, he said, overall, this book is a linear structure. He goes, these different sections. He says, fifth, non-ideological reasons for choosing between the political worldviews. Adam, do you think there's any chance in hell he's going to be giving us non-ideological reasons for choosing liberals over conservatives? Do you think so? Do you think they'll be
Well,
non-ideological?
yeah, I mean, he said so. He said this is just
Oh,
an analytical book. I mean, I don't see any way that this is not purely just analytical looking at the data. I mean, this is objective. There's no subjectivity anywhere in this book.
it's astounding to me
Hmm.
that he can write that, and I take him at his word that he believes it.
Hmm.
He really is going to provide me with me as a
Hmm.
reader, he doesn't know me, with non-ideological reasons to believe the way he
Hmm.
believes.
Well,
After insulting conservatives
mhm.
through the entire first chapter,
Mhm.
just bizarro.
Well, I think that's the same problem going back to what I was saying about journalists and academics as a whole, is that they automatically assume that what they believe is the analytical, objective point of view. And they're
Yeah,
assuming, well, of course, this is the analytical perspective. I am the one who has the facts on my side. I have, X, Y, and Z, and they leave no room for any consideration of the other side. And I think that's, what we talked about through all of last season is that, well, they are the relativists in name, saying, well, I believe that everybody should be free to do whatever they want, stuff like that. And I believe that that is absolutely true, and you have to let people do that, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very strange way of looking at all of it, but I think
yeah.
they truly believe that they are being objective.
Mm. Yeah, it's wild, and I run into that. I don't usually talk politics like with people I know, or especially at work or social
Mhm,
functions, all that good stuff, just because I don't want to mess with it. But I did mention you last night. We're at a dinner,
mhm,
and it's among friends, and one couple is certainly left.
mhm,
But they're Facebook friends with your mother, and she put on there, you're going to college and
mhm,
grad school, all that stuff. That's really cool. And he congratulated us on your achievement. I don't know if we had much to do with it, but anyway, so it was very nice. And I mentioned I'm now mentioning the process of your acceptance and your
mhm,
rejection
mhm.
at different
Yeah.
places, because I think it is telling. I also think it's complimentary to you that you stuck to your guns. You put in there on your application, certain political volunteer work you did and all that kind of
Mhm,
stuff. I think it was ballsy, and I guess it paid off. But anyway, so I mentioned anyway, getting to the point.
yes.
I mentioned that reminded him that you were did that internship with Josh
Mhm,
Hawley, and when you mentioned Josh Hawley, for some reason the leftists hate him, and I'm
mhm,
not exactly. I haven't quite. I need to kind of go down that path with some of them to understand fully why, other than MSNBC says he's a terrible person, because he's
mhm,
really. I don't think he's far right.
mhm,
I think he has some policy that he favors that are not that I think liberals would favor, like the family,
mhm,
certainly protecting the family, certainly government intervention, and the tax code for that you wouldn't see from somebody that's more typically conservative. But in any event, and so now, but now because they feel that they must tell me
mm,
that they don't like Hawley. Well, that's not about Hawley, right?
mhm.
So I must tell them, well, I like everything about him. Yeah, I like everything he's done. And I don't
Mm,
know if I
mhm.
know I like
Yeah.
everything. I don't know everything he's done.
Yes.
And it's like you just dropped a rotten egg in front of them. Ooh,
Mhm. Yeah.
like I've met one. Like they think like I'm a gorilla in the mist. Like, ooh,
Mhm.
who is a strange creature all of a
Yeah.
sudden? He's just morphed into some strange thing.
Mhm,
But I think it's part of it. They just don't, maybe they're not. It's not.
mhm,
They're not faced with somebody saying, "I really like Holly,"
mhm,
because they think it's okay for them to say, "Well, I really don't like anything about him."
mhm.
Are you
Yeah.
volunteering that? I don't care
Yeah.
if you like him or not. It has
And I've
nothing to do
had
with
that
the
that that
point.
that same thing happen, all over the place. Is like you never see, at least in my experience, you very rarely see, if a conservative's talking to a liberal person, they say, "Oh, well, I interned, for this liberal person, or I worked for this person." You never see the conservative, "Oh, well, I don't like them, but good for
Yeah,
you," But it's every time you have someone on the left, and that you hear someone mention, because I've mentioned this to people that I know are left leaning or in some capacity. I'll mention my internship, and it's like, "Oh yeah, well, I worked for Josh Hawley out in Washington D.C." Like, "Oh, well, I don't like Hawley, but I'm sure that must have been still been a fun
yeah,
experience for you." And it's like, why are you? I don't need to know that. That lends nothing to the second half of what you're saying. But they always feel the need to preface with that. It's like,
yeah,
well, I don't like it, but
yeah.
it's like, okay,
It's like they can't help themselves. It's
yeah,
like it's irrelevant,
hmm,
So maybe that's what I'll start doing. Irrelevant. I'll just say that irrelevant. I like him. I don't know about like him. I mean, it seems fine. I don't really have any personal loyalty to the guy, but
yeah,
it's weird, and I think it's
yes,
part of the same thing that this author is struggling with is they just have to
hmm.
say much how bad conservatives are.
And that's really how he's.
He's gotten this book. He's got like probably a contract to write the book
Mhm,
based on it's probably a prospectus or something like that. This is what I'm going to write about,
mhm.
and he can't help himself.
Yeah.
It's weird.
Yeah, it's like, and that's exactly what he's doing throughout every section. When he's talking about the conservatives, he's like, "Well, I don't like them, but we should see what they're saying. Well, I don't like them, but this is how they categorize things." And it's like that's really what he's saying at every
Yes.
point in this preface and in this chapter one, setting up the book, is
Mhm.
like always looking at them as this some sort of weird, gross other thing that
Yes.
we have to explain
We
people
must
to
study
learn
these
about. Yeah.
evil beings before they take over the world and destroy
Yes.
everything we've built.
Yes. All right. Well, do you have any other final thoughts for chapter one here?
No.
All right. Well, this has been season 8, episode 2 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
Still Mark Bishop.
And then I don't have to read chapter 2 for next week,
I
but
do.
you do. And maybe
We'll make a note itself. Should I,
be in person if you bring your
should I
stuff
bring my
up.
stuff up? All right, I'll do
Yeah, we
that.
can do that. We can do that. Yeah, next
Make
in
everybody else
person.
wait outside or something. Or you can come to the hotel room. We can
Oh,
carry
there
it
you
up.
go.